Hello and welcome to the world's first Paul Weller fan podcast. I'm Dan Jennings, and on this episode, delighted to be joined by one of the world's most influential and visionary image makers, Knight CBE. Nick is the founder and director of the pioneering SHOWstudio, and across his career, he's consistently challenged ideas of beauty while collaborating with fashion legends like Alexander McQueen, Galliano and Yohji Yamamoto, and artists including Björk, Lady Gaga and Kanye West. For Paul Weller fans, Nick's photographs are iconic. From the Style Council era through to Paul's solo career, he captured some of Weller's most striking images. From the inlay of our favourite shop to that unforgettable debut solo album cover, we're going to cover it all. In our conversation, Nick shares how he first connected with Paul, what made Weller such a unique subject to photograph, and the stories behind those legendary shoots. Oh, and whilst I remember how he nearly killed Paul Weller. Just a small thing. Let's get into it. Nick Knight, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure, Dan. Good to speak to you.
Let's talk about the first connection with Paul Weller. Would that have been presumably through the music? Were you a Jam fan or was it into the Style Council?
No, it would have been the Jam. I'm trying to remember. I think I saw them play Cambridge Corn Exchange. I used to live up near Cambridge, about 20 miles outside of it. The nearest music venue for me would have been Cambridge Corn Exchange. And I'm pretty certain that they were playing that, and that's, I think, where I first came into contact with them. Sketchy memories, but I can't remember it very well. It wasn't a sketchy event.
But the music scene at that point, it was such an exciting thing to be young and to have all that music around, wasn't it?
Yeah, I wouldn't look back at it as a golden age. Yeah, of course it was exciting, and the whole of the kind of punk and new wave thing that was happening was really so different from anything else that was going on, and I think it's really hard for people to grasp that now. You know, it was just way out on a limb. I mean, Paul was never really part of the punk scene, but came along at the same time with the same energy. And those early Jam records were really so incredible. Sort of, musically and sonically, it was just coming from a different place that nobody ever come from before. It didn't feel like a revival. It didn't feel like things were better in the good old days. It really felt like here was a new sort of music, a new sound. And you really wanted to see who was creating this. And I think visually, again, I think people don't really understand it now, is you couldn't get any contact with the artist whatsoever. The only time you could hear a record pretty much was if the radio played it, which they didn't. So you'd have to go to somewhere to hear it, which is like go to a record shop and listen to it or buy the record. Access to music was so limited in those days. If I'm truthful, it wasn't my genre of music. Mid-70s, I was into Northern Soul. So the Jam and punk were not on my kind of necessarily my sort of, the music I wanted to listen to dance or just to kind of feel great. So it wasn't that it was my thing. And I was sort of just coming out of one skinhead era and going into another. Things like ska, Northern Soul, Town and Motown were much more my thing. But I think certainly those are some of Paul's references as well, certainly Town and Motown. It's more sort of you saw the impact that this music was having and that you could tell it was so out there. That doesn't mean to say that I was a huge, devoted fan of any of the punk bands, to be honest, whether it was Sex Pistols or The Clash or whoever. It was just kind of clear they were amazing. But it doesn't mean to say that they were people I wanted to go and listen to, if you see the subtle difference.
I guess the Jam towards the end maybe was more your bag then, in terms of when he starts introducing horn sections and backing singers and all that. But then as we go into the Style Council, was that more your kind of cup of tea?
Yeah, basically that sort of our influences started to converge at that point. I mean, I was really into sort of music from the States, a lot of kind of what was going on in New York in the end of the 1970s, the beginning of the rap scene, the hip-hop scene. That was much more where I was going. So I guess Style Council has much more of those elements to them. And I found a sort of musical kinship. I mean, don't get me wrong. I really, really liked what he was doing in the Jam, and the energy was incredible. But, if you're into black music, you're into black music. Huh? I think it's one of the sort of funny things that because of the scarcity of actually being able to see the people that played the music you loved, either through, going to concerts or through album covers, that was your only way in. Your album cover was the only way into the physicality of the band. Other than going to see them. And of course, going to see a band is fine if it's a band that's playing in Britain, but most weren't. It was a really long time spent just staring at one image.
Which leads us beautifully into what's next. So in terms of the photography, what was your first connection with Paul and how did that come about? Can you remember?
I really knew of him for a long time. So it wasn't that I discovered him through my photography, but I think I was sent to do a session with him, a portrait of him for Blitz magazine. Now, there was like 3 magazines in the 80s. One was The Face, one was ID, and one was Blitz. And Blitz was a slightly kind of weirder little brother of the other 2. I think it was Blitz that asked me to go and do a portrait of him. So I went down to his recording studio, and that's where I think I took my first pictures of him. But then that quickly, we did a session in the studio for ID magazine. I started doing record covers from there. He was such an interesting man to photograph. Because he really, he still does, really had a look to him. I mean, the Style Council were appropriately named, but, he has such a great look to him. Very seldom will you see somebody that manages to make things look right. And you just think, Christ, that kid or that bloke knows how to dress. Quite rare. You see a lot of people around, but they don't necessarily know how to dress with such an innate sense of style. Very rare to see somebody who can put it together like that. And that's, obviously what Paul's done over the years and is still doing, which is great for us in our 60s to be able to see that. It is rare that you get somebody who can do such an interesting hybrid and not just mimicking stuff, because a lot of people will just mimic. Just do what their elder brothers did. They'll just do a scene from like 20 years before they were born, or, there's all that revival stuff, which is fine. People are into what they're into. And, I caught the tail end of skinhead. So in a way, I'm just as guilty of sort of replicating fashion that's already happened. But Paul managed to take elements of mod, skinhead, but then sort of weave them together in such an interesting way, such a kind of stylish way. I think that really sets him aside from so many people in this business who just kind of wholesale recreate a look from another time. And I think what Paul did, especially when I was photographing him earlier on, you felt that he was pulling on elements just like he was sonically and combining them to make a new sound or a new vision within a certain genre. So his music was soulful, but it wasn't just aping American soul. And the way he dressed was kind of had moments of mod in it, but it wasn't. In the beginning, it was more into it, but as he got slightly more developed in it, it wasn't just a resale, a sort of showing you what kids used to wear in the 60s. Of course, is where it started. Same way that I was into skinhead. It wasn't just that sort of whole revival of something that's already passed. And that's the funny thing about fashion. And that's sort of, where I've had my whole career has been in fashion. Fashion isn't just putting the clothes on. It's how you put them on, what you put together, all the small details, every kind of, half-inch change in a shirt stand or a cuff length, all the fractional details that people put into dressing who know how to dress. It's a real art form. People don't like fashion, and especially in this country, they view it as silly or a vanity or a sin, or people are weird about fashion in Britain. Some of the greatest fashions, I think, have come from our streets. And I know that sounds like a cliche, but, I was a skinhead for, 5 years or something. I still look like that now, is a sad or real truth, because I can't find anything I prefer as a natural way to be. So I still have basically the same clothes that I would have worn, when I was a teenager, just different versions. The suits are now bought from tailors on Savile Row and the shirts are handmade and everything else, which you would never have had as a sort of 16-year-old. You'd never have the cash to do that, not to the level, that you aspired to. But, even all going through and out of kind of, modern skinhead and into kind of the 70s. That's what was the great thing about punk in the 70s, is it just was such a huge explosion of style that was kind of so nothing to do with anything else. It was so out on a limb that, that was what was, I think, so thrilling about it. It looked like nothing. It looked like nothing I'd ever seen. So that was the sort of energy. But, you put that aside and you look at what was happening with football casuals and what was going on in the kind of early 80s on that scene. And people were wearing stuff that, was kind of so glamorous. The brands they were wearing, Italian brands and French brands were so chic. I don't know if they knew what they were doing, most of them, but the ones who did really did. So a lot of that style that comes without magazines telling you what to wear or without fashion photographers showing you what to wear, most of that is just kids who are sharp, who know how to put together stuff and know what brands to go and buy and how to rearrange it. fashion was such a huge part of the development of those youth cults. If you look at punk, it was like a handful, 20 kids that really invented it. And then they put it together and then it becomes countrywide and then it becomes worldwide. And of course, then it gets very systematic and very uninventive, if you want, to come to uniform. But of course, when these things first start, it's not at all what it's like. It's the sharpest kid, who can put stuff together. Yeah. And Paul certainly had that. He was one of those, he's a man now, but he was a kid at the time. He's one of those kids that knew how to dress. Where you get an innate sense of style from, God only knows. But I guess it's just some people have it, some people don't, but very few do.
He's always somebody who's worn his influences on his sleeve, both in terms of his music, but sometimes the look as well. So the inside of Our Favourite Shop album cover was essentially a recreation of the David Bailey, Lennon McCartney shot, right? So that was something that he overtly had a conversation with you and said that he wanted to recreate. Did that come about from that like that?
I think they're influences, and they're just like musical influences. You don't take them and just have them exact. You need to tweak them. You need to make them feel contemporary. You need to see them again. It's just like he does in his music. Really, one of the other artists I work with a lot is Kanye West. Over the years, obviously, Kanye's had a very volatile life, but his musical career and his visual career, really, really sharp. And, Kanye could put things together and does put things together, which nobody else would ever dream of. And he pulls on stuff from left, right, and centre, and then the same you see in the music. And it's what Paul does too, is kind of find these things that he loves and just finds a way of making them feel of today and not of yesterday, or even of tomorrow for most kids. So there's a certain sense of, you're right. In My Favourite Shop, there's a little bit of kind of a nod and a wink, probably quite a big nod and a wink to Bailey and the 60s portraits and Mick Jagger and the Cray Twins and those half a dozen portraits that Bailey created in the 60s, which became iconic versions of stylish portraiture. It's a thing. And I think what Paul also does really well, and what I find really interesting, is a lot of guys get really curmudgeonly when they get past a certain age. And kind of, nobody knows how to dress anymore, and in my day, and all kids wearing all that sort of stuff. He doesn't do that. Sure, he has very strong feelings. I'm sure he expresses them, because it wasn't better in our day. We couldn't access any clothes. We had no fucking idea what we were trying to get hold of in the first place, but there was no access to anything. It really was not better in the 1970s, but you could just about throw a look together, normally from vintage shops, second-hand clothes shops, and Army Navy stores. There were very few fashionable boutiques if you lived provincially. If you lived in London, sure, you had access to a few more things. But if you lived provincially, and I was out 20 miles from Cambridge, so I was out in the middle of nowhere, you couldn't access gear, you couldn't get clothes. I remember we used to have a pair of Dr. Martens, which now sounds like, what? And we had to share them. It would go around my group of friends. They were painted silver and had a hawk window up the side. And we also had a pair of platform boots, which did the same thing. Which kind of, you'd have it for a week, and then you'd have to pass it on to your mate. And then he'd have it for a week, and he'd pass it on to his mate. And if you're lucky, you had a small enough friend circle, and they'd come back round to you. But no, the clothes weren't accessible in any way like they are today. So, anybody who says that we had it great in the 70s is just deluding themselves. It was bleak. But it did make people stand out. The few people that did know how to dress and could source the clothes from wherever their family or Army Navy stores, they stood out. There was one guy, as I said, I wasn't into punk. It wasn't my thing. I'm sorry, but it wasn't my thing. And I was into black dance music, and that was what I loved. But there was one guy, I used to live in a little town called Huntingdon, which is come up the A1 and pretty godforsaken, to be honest, in the 1970s. And there was one punk, and that wasn't just in Huntingdon. His patch was the whole of Cambridgeshire. There was about one punk in Cambridgeshire. And you'd see the guy everywhere. It was fucking, he's wearing bright yellow hair. So of course you'd see him everywhere. There wasn't like 50 or 10. One guy. So I think you have to realise that we live in a time now where things are mercifully accessible. If you want a pair of vintage whatevers, if you want to get something from the latest Japanese brand or the American version or whatever, you can. Literally just go on internet and it's there. You didn't have to sort of spend your whole day tracking down a pair of shoes, hoping that they'd fit you and accepting a pair that were too big or too small because they didn't. If I was the only one in the shop that you'd travelled half the day to get to. It was a very different time. And I think what I was trying to say is that what Paul seems to be doing, and has done, as far as I can see, all the way through his career, has not done that. He hasn't done that, it was all better in my day. His kids don't know how to dress. The men's silhouettes really changed. I'm getting too fashionable for you. Stop me, because it might be of no interest to you or anybody. But, if you look at what a man would wear before, it was a line. It was all about the line. If you look at sort of covert coat or a greatcoat or any of those things. It was a long line. It was to make you look long and give you a certain shape. Nowadays, a lot of people wear puffer jackets, which doesn't give you any form of line, gives you a kind of circular aspect, which is not necessarily what people look for when they try and look elegant. So it's a very different aesthetic now. Of course, that's not the only thing, but if you look at the high street, if you walk along any high street, look at how most people are dressed. The long line's gone. You don't see it. Just see a lot of people in padded puffer jackets or puffer coats or whatever, which is amazing. It's the whole street fashion, that's obvious. But it's a completely different aesthetic, and people don't notice this stuff. I'm sure Paul does. But, before you would dress to make yourself look longer and sleeker and sharper and all those sorts of things. And now you dress in a circular aesthetic. Maybe I blame Kanye for that one. Maybe that's down to him.
A lot of things are probably Kanye's fault, to be fair. Yeah. One of the things that Paul was hunting out in the time that you were taking photos was the white Levi's. So this come up in conversation quite a lot on the podcast. And actually, you got this. So when you were shooting them for Around the Cost of Loving, the Orange album, and the singles around that time, you got some wonderful shots with Paul and Mick and I think the white Levi's or the white, and D, and that is that was something that as a band they always look sharp. What are your memories of that shoot around that time?
It was one of the most terrifying moments. Just a little known fact: I nearly killed Paul on that shoot because it was taking place in a recording studio where he was shooting a video, and to get the shot that he wanted and I wanted, I had to go up into the sort of gantry above the band and look straight down on them. You can imagine in a studio, heat rises, so it gets really hot at the top of a TV studio or a film studio. And you're up in the gantry up there and you're on basically sort of metal decking, looking directly down. In those days, cameras were big. And I remember my assistant, lovely chap called Andy Knight, again, a classic dresser. He was helping on a shoot, passed me a lens for the Hasselblad because we were changing lenses. And a lens weighs like a bag of sugar, but it's not soft. So he passed me a lens to swap. And literally, I fumbled it. Only by the grace of God did it not, because I was directly above the band. A little bit of a kind of couple of inches either way or less, or not quite for the grace of God, didn't kill him. I don't know if he ever knows that, actually, but it was really...
So it fell and shattered on the floor, or what?
Well, it would have done. Luckily, I didn't drop it.
Oh, okay.
Luckily, I managed to hold on to it, but it slipped through my fingers and slipped back into Andy's grasp when he passed it back to me. But it's one of those things that, you get your camera set up, everything's in place, Paul's down there with everybody else, all looking up at you. You think, that's too I need a longer lens. So you get a longer lens, you think it's plugged in and it's not, it goes straight back off again. My main memory from that was that. And of course, he was recording a video, so he didn't have much time. A lot of those sessions, you got what you could in a short time. Again, because I was starting out and I was beginning of my career, actually doesn't make much difference now, but you didn't get much time with people. You get like 20 minutes, half an hour, maybe an hour if you're lucky to get all the pictures you possibly could. We're pretty busy working trying to get stuff. You've also got to try and get all the band together in one place and stop them being distracted and everything else. So you're kind of fighting the logistics of trying to do a shoot on somebody else's set, which is never particularly desirable or easy. We got what we got. And I think the funny thing is that, back in when they've got that real authentic kind of TV set studio to them, even the kind of, I think it's the lighting they use on TV sets, which is kind of weird lighting. It's like non-directional lighting, so everything's lit, but nothing's lit. It's not like putting a spotlight on somebody. They just light the room. So probably added to the heat up there was all these blasted lights. But it has that kind of 60s, that sort of great, you look back at any old like Little Richard footage or the great performers, Wilson Pickett or any of those guys, you can see that sort of lighting and that feeling. You would get moments that would wittingly or unwittingly pull from some quite referenced moment from the past, but not just recreate it, not just go wholesale just to make it look like that, but just add it. It's like if you're making a meal, you kind of put in a bit of this from here and a bit of that from there, and overall it might have a kind of Italian taste or a French taste or whatever it is, but it's the idea that you're not just recreating wholesale something from the past. And he also had a very contemporary voice. His singing style, the sound of his actual voice was very urban, very kind of Britain 1970s when he first heard it. It was exactly right. And it sounded like it, it's what he was. And that's what came across. And I think his persona and his style comes through as unique and of its time. I mean, I guess, other bands have done that. The Stones pulled on a whole bunch of different artists from America and nobody really recognized or realized for a while. But you knew it was there. All had the same thing, But again, it was like, these people, American recording artists were so far away from us. They must have been on a different planet. So if you heard something, it would stay with you and you'd long to hear it again. And some of the only times you could hear it is if it played in the dance hall or if it was, but it was seldom on the radio, to be honest.
You obviously formed a connection with Paul because when it comes around to his solo career, you're the first person he gets in touch with for the shoot for that Into Tomorrow, that first debut single. And of course, that first album cover. We're talking Paul Weller Movement Time.
Yeah, I think people get an ease with people they work with a lot, you know? I think there's other photographers had that relationship. I think that Bob Gruen had a great relationship with John Lennon. You know, there's certain photographers that the artist's happy to have around them, partly because they're relaxed in their company, partly because they share a mutual agreement of what looks good, what they think looks good. So there's a sort of like a shorthand for visuals that they don't have to explain every time what they want. But it is always a relationship. It's never like, you know, you just go and do what you're going to do and, you know, the artist isn't involved. It is always a relationship. You always talk, you always show them things, whether it's a Polaroid or you let them look through the camera and see the lighting or whatever it is. It's no fun if you just do it by yourself. If you're working with Paul Weller, it's a privilege and a joy because the man's got such insight. And if you don't listen to what they're saying, that's such a waste. I guess that we worked together enough times to develop some sort of bond, some sort of mutual understanding of what visuals should be. And Paul was often quite surprising of what he'd sort of want to look like. I remember one of the moments where I just thought to myself, yes, is the one he wanted to wear the jacket I was wearing for the photo shoot. I had a pale blue, back in the early 80s, a pale blue cord jacket, which I got from a French band called Chippy, which are probably dreadful now or closed. But at the time they felt great. And I remember Paul seeing that and going, yeah, Nick, can I just put that jacket on? And I said, yes, at last. Stylistic recognition from one of the greats. So, yeah, you could never quite tell where the session was going to go. But he wasn't hard to photograph, you know. He's an easy man to photograph because he knew how to perform and, you know, he was up for it. The worst thing is when you get a band and they actually don't really want to be there. You know, you're really pulling teeth just to try and get them to stay in front of the camera. I did a lot of my early work. I guess it's the way you learn, being sent out by the papers like the New Musical Express to photograph artists. You get like kind of 10 minutes with them and they'd be in some hotel bedroom or recording studio or whatever. They had no fucking idea who you were, the publication you were working for. And you were just a long line of photographers who they had to deal with that day. So they were never really in a good mood. To start my career doing that sort of work, so doing portraits for the NME of different artists, you develop, as we were saying, relationships with the artists and they get used to being with you. And then they ask you to do their single cover, their album cover, and the sort of relationships normally develop that way. So people like Elvis Costello, Psychedelic Furs, you know, there are quite a lot of bands that I sort of got friendly with by photographing for the NME. But it did mean that sometimes you get guys, you know, who you get on with, but the rest of the band were really tricky. Either didn't want to be there or you wish they weren't there.
Right.
The lead singer looks amazing and the rest of them are a bit like, oh, yeah, okay, let's see, we can put you a little bit further back. That's normally the problem with band sessions, is that you got one or two people who know how to stand, know how to look, know how to work the light, etc. And then you've got two or three other people who really shouldn't be in front of a camera. So not for an album cover. But Paul knew how to stand. He obviously knew how to work everything, could throw it all together. And he was surrounded by some pretty authentic looking people, you know, Mick Talbot and Dee and everybody. You know, they also knew how to put it together. And I'm sure Paul had a lot to do with art directing the style of the rest of the band, as you can tell from all that white Levi's. They took it well and they knew how to wear it, you know. I mean, a lot of it comes from the street, in the way that some kids just know how to dress, you know, and you can see them on the street. And back in my old skinhead days, you could see the people who looked just great. I remember there's one guy in my local area who could just put it together, and he was so sharp. There's a big estate in Huntingdon called the Oxmoor Estate, which is London Overspill Estate. So you've got a lot of young kids who either started their lives in London or their parents were set of connections. You know, this kid was so sharp. And he had his two-tone blazer and his button-down pocket handkerchief, and everything about him was spot on. I mean, I keep using the word sharp because that's what, you know, the thing that makes you think of most. But, you know, he had a wicked sense of humour. You know, you wouldn't mess with him. A lot of that innate style comes from the street, I think. There wasn't anything to do. Honestly, there was nowhere to go. So you would just be meeting sort of around local bus stops, and that was our nightlife. You know, you go across the local village where there'd be like 15 kids, you know, all just hanging around a fucking bus stop all night long. And that was it, because you weren't going to get into the pub.
Yeah.
So life was deadly glamorous. But that's what most of Britain was like. Of course, if you lived in London, a different scene, or any of the big, you know, Manchester or Liverpool, yeah, very different scene. Most of England was very provincial. And that's what provincial life was like. and you were desperate to sort of mimic anything you'd seen on Top of the Pops or some album cover or whatever it was, with no means and no access. But the kids who could do it, were just always so impressive. I remember this kid, he's called Spyro. He was just like kind of so awesome in terms of some guy who was just flash. It's just that sort of look, and that sort of way of being. And Paul wasn't flash ever, I don't think. I don't think he was put that adjective on him, because he was a lot more to that slightly kind of cool dress back thing where you're not trying to stand out, but you are, because you got it right and nobody else has. But it was all about, who could get the first shirt and who could get the first pair of Stay Pressed or first pair of churches or whatever it was.
You mentioned album covers earlier on. And again, if you think about Paul and this kind of look that we're talking about now, that Paul Weller solo, that first album, that image on the front. I've got the vinyl here in front of me. And actually, as an album cover, it's quite strange because, if you're looking at it in the shop, Paul's at the wrong angle, the lettering, you have to turn it up the other way, don't you, to look at it? Because it's one of those ones where you pull the full gatefold out. You've got this beautiful long image of Paul. It's kind of, just looking, the absolute dog's bollocks. This was my discovery of Paul Weller around that time.
Oh, really?
And he just looks, that image is just so brilliant, isn't it?
Yeah, you've got to be able to be somebody to pull off that shirt, though.
Yeah,
that's what I mean.
Absolute
it's not flashy because he assumes it. So he looks great in it. I have the same shirt. I don't look great in
it. My wife would be like, "What the hell are you wearing?" Exactly.
Well, I think that's what his dad used to say to him. His dad was always rather what's that fucking shirt? His dad would give him a bit of a hard time, I'm sure. But he got his sense of start from somewhere, probably from his dad in the end. But yeah, no, that shirt's amazing. I don't know who made his. There's a brilliant shirt maker called Frank Foster down on Pall Mall. He used to make shirts for anybody who was anybody in the 60s. And 70s. So any actor, any footballer, photographer, any kind of people who we all know the names of now from that era, they would have gone down to Frank Foster's to have their shirts made. Because, again, it's that thing that I can't get across to people enough. You had to have your shirts made. So you'd have to go to a shirt maker. So you couldn't go and buy a shirt unless you wanted some horrible thing. But you'd have a half-decent shirt. You had to go to a guy, nearly always a guy, who would make you a shirt. Frank Foster was like one of the best. He was down on Pall Mall, so he was one of the best. And he used to have a club in South London. I can't remember the name of it now. Next one of the clubs the Cray twins had. And he used to drive an Aston Martin. So this is a shirt maker. So you can tell.
He was clearly doing all right, yeah.
He was doing all right for himself. I don't know if that's a Frank Foster shirt that Paul's got, but it's very similar. If you look at sort of 70s people like George Lazenby, and if you look at Roger Moore's shirts in the 70s, that's where they all came from Frank Foster. Right. And there was even kind of a special cuff that he'd invented and all that sort of stuff. That picture was, blame Mr. Halfon, Simon Halfon, for how that looks, or credit Mr. Halfon for how it looks, but how you view it. But yeah, it was a slightly strange delivery of an image, but what are you going to do? It's a square format, and it looks better, as we spoke about. It's that long line, and I think that's kind of probably what Simon was trying to achieve with the album cover, and decided fans would want to see that big, and they'd probably put it on their wall. But the album covers were really, by then it was slightly waning, but certainly through the 70s, and early into the 80s, album covers were such a thing. You get to do an album cover that was just, people don't realise it was such an ambition to do those. And it was always my ambition to work closely with an artist. I wasn't ever into doing the idea of doing loads and loads of different artists. So I needed to find somebody, I wanted to find somebody who I respected and I admired, and who was, had a certain innate sense of style, so that you've got something, something incredible to photograph. I wish I'd had multiple lives, but in the end, only working with a few people. And Paul, for a long time, was one of the only artists I'd worked with. Didn't want to work with everybody. I think that's what went on. I've worked with a few fashion designers, John Galliano, Alexander McQueen, Yohji Yamamoto, for a long time in my life. They're 10-year relationships. It's not like you just jump around. And the same thing for music. Obviously, he was a long musical relationship, and so was Paul. You find people will come back to you again and again because you get something in them, and they're relaxed with you, and they can see something in your work that they need. I've also been photographed quite a lot in my lifetime. And you really, really don't want to go into a session with somebody who can't take a good photograph. And there's so many people out there. Just think, oh, Christ, man. I can tell just because I know what lens they're screwing on their camera straight away whether the person in front of you is going to make you look like an idiot, or where he's going to get something and make you look like you're proud of yourself, like you want to look, like you hope you look. There's always a difference between how we think we look and how we actually look. And you want a photographer in front of you to make you look better than you think you look. That is certainly not worse than you really do look. So kind of often the case. A lot of our memories of the 60s, 70s and 80s really are through photographers' eyes. You know, of course, there's a lot of photographers around, but you don't remember the bad pictures. You remember the great ones, you know, and that's where we develop our sense of culture from. And fashion is a very, very good indicator of culture. If you're some sort of a culture historian, no better way of understanding society by looking at the fashion images that were created for that society, because it's what we want to look like, what we aspire to be. It's not what we are. That's reportage, different thing. But fashion photography is a great way of showing what people really want to look like, what they like to project and what they like to think they look like. So I think the relationships like mine and Paul's were based a bit on that. When I work for somebody, it's a choice. You know, I only want to work with people who I really respect. You can't take a good picture of somebody you don't respect. The relationships are few and far between, you know. You can't make them happen. Björk is another one I work with a lot. Gaga is another one. You know, you also don't want to work with people who are all the same. So you want to find people who are different, and then you don't work with anybody who's similar. You know, it's not you've got many people similar to Paul, but don't want to work with people who are a bit of a kind of version of the other person. Fine if you only ever work for one person, but if you're working for more than one person, they shouldn't overlap stylistically. I just think that's a bit unfair. You need to feel that your photographer is a photographer that makes you look great and understand you. It isn't doing the same thing for, you know, a whole bunch of people you don't respect.
Did you get to go on the road with Paul and the band at all, Nick?
No, location-based or studio-based. I became increasingly a studio photographer throughout the kind of 80s, I guess. I started photographing on the streets when I did the first thing I ever did, which was skinhead. And then I saw quite quickly, after doing a lot of new musical express work, a lot of hotel bedrooms and lobbies and everything else, which isn't a nice way to work. I sort of found that the studios where I sort of perfected my craft, just work on the lighting and the relationship you have between you and the person you're photographing and how to get the most out of them. You go outside, you go on location, you're fighting a lot of other stuff. People hooting their horn and people trying to get in a picture and the light being in the wrong place. And it's a cacophony of a visual when you go outside. For a photographer who spent a whole life virtually in the studio, you go outside, it's a bit like, whoa, that's a lot. That's a lot. And when you're in the studio, you've basically got a white background and whatever you put in front of it is all you choose to put in front of it. It doesn't come with a car and a tree and a bike and a bus shed and everything else. It just is what you put in front of it. So that's why gravitated to the studio and didn't really go on tour, didn't go on the road with them. Probably wasn't asked, to be honest. Probably because he could realise also that that's where he felt get my best work of him. Quite sussed on his behalf. What I dealt with Paul was what you see. It's again that thing, when people come into my studio, that's where we exist. I don't tend to have a social life with the people around that I work with. You know, I don't meet in parties or pubs and the stuff I've seen in any case. Yeah, I tend just to see Paul when you step in front of my camera. That's where you see him. Yeah, there wasn't a lot of other certain circumstances where I'd actually sort of meet the people I'm photographing. You tended to go across to discuss things, but it was usually to a studio, sometimes to his house, but usually to a studio. And then everything else was sort of with Simon Halfon, who'd come to the house, my house down there in Petersham near Richmond, and discuss things. People often think, because you work something like your mates in the sort of more sort of conventional way of that you party together and go out and drink together and do whatever you're going to do together. No, you meet them when they walk in front of your lens. And that's where they exist. And that's the appropriate place for me to have people, whether it's Paul or whether it's Kate Moss, it's in front of my lens, not any other place.
Let me ask you two final questions. So
sure.
That first solo album, in terms musically, feels like that would be right up your street from those kind of connections of Northern Soul, Motown, all that type of stuff. It's got a real kind of R&B vibe to it, right?
Yeah, 100%. I still play it. I still listen to it now. It still makes me feel great. Yeah, I mean, nearly all his music does, to be honest. I got a little bit kind of sidetracked when I went off into Gaga land and Kanye land. Heard less of his stuff, but recently are just beautiful. And they are exactly as you say. Yeah, they're so sort of... They've got the same thing, that beat and the way he puts everything together sonically. It's just so beautiful and so sharp. Yeah, but it's what he is. You know, it's kind of people are very coherent to their art form. You see what I mean? People tend to look like their art, whether you're a painter or a singer or a photographer. When somebody can hold one of your pictures or photographs or listen to one of your songs, and it looks like you, that's when you know it's on track.
I love this idea, though, of you kind of going, okay, I'm just going to have a little listen to that album. I'm getting the vinyl out. We all put the kind of sleeve up on the top of the record player.
Oh, yeah.
But that's your photo. That's so cool. Do you know what I mean? You're listening to the record going, oh, that's my image. Really? It's amazing.
Yeah, okay. Well, remember, Dan, I spent a good 10 years, if not 15 years of my life sitting there looking at somebody else's picture thinking, oh, I wish I'd taken that picture.
Yeah.
So I guess it's payback in that way.
Final question. So I always ask everybody on the podcast and also for the book that you're allowed one Paul Weller song for the rest of your life. It could be The Jam, The Style Council, or solo. What would you go with?
I don't know. That's Entertainment, probably.
Oh, that is such a great tune. Yeah.
Well, it's got energy to it. And it mixes the two for me. You know, it mixes the kind of energy of kind of the world I saw around me on the street in the end of the 70s, and just such a powerful blast of great energy. It sums up a lot of how I saw the world at the time and a lot of how I felt, but it really grabs you. It's weird when music can do that to you, and it does it so well. Photography really struggles to have the same emotive impact. If only for, God only could I could take a picture that felt the same as listening to That's Entertainment, That's what you want to aim for. That's what you always want to aim for, is to have that emotional connection to the people who are seeing your work. If you can hit them the way that song hits, that would be an achievement. Still working on that one, Dan. Still working on that one. I haven't finished yet.
Well, that's good to hear as well. This has been such a blast. Thank you, Nick. I really appreciate your time, man.
Yeah, no worries. Glad we got to do it in the end.
My thanks once again to Nick Knight CBE for joining me on the podcast. What an honor. If you want to find out more, head to my website, paulwellerfanpodcast.com, and you can read Nick's stories in my upcoming book. Yes, it's very nearly here. Paul Weller, Dancing Through the Fire, the authorized oral history, lands on September the 11th, published by Constable from Little Brown, and available from all good bookshops, Waterstones, Amazon, WH Smith, and a bunch of brilliant independents, including Rough Trade and Resident, who have some great exclusive offers on as well. Get your order in, spread the word, and hopefully too, join us at our London launch. We'll be at Metronome the night before publication with some very, very special guests. Details to be announced soon on those, but get your ticket. It'll be Wednesday the 10th of September, the evening of. We'll be starting around 7 o'clock. Doors open at 6:30, so we'll see you there. Metronome in London. Grab your tickets online. Get in touch if you need more details. paulwellerfanpodcast.com. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next time.